Okay, welcome back to Gary's Economics. Today we are going to do part 3 in our educational series, Understanding Wealth Inequality and the Economy, and we're going to explain why economists don't talk about wealth inequality. Okay, so in the first 2 videos in this series, we explained firstly, what is wealth? Secondly, what is wealth inequality and why it is destroying our living standards and making people poorer. Today's video, we're going to explain if wealth inequality is so important, why is it that other economists don't talk about it? Okay, so the first reason economists don't talk about inequality is because of the way economics is taught at universities. So for those who don't know, I studied maths and economics at the London School of Economics for 3 years for my undergrad. And then I did a 2-year master's in economics at Oxford. So I've spent 5 years at elite economics departments learning economics. And I think it's important to understand the way that economics is taught at universities nowadays. So the first thing to say is, and I think this will surprise a lot of people, in economics departments, we don't talk about the housing crisis. We don't talk about why housing is unaffordable. We don't talk about falling living standards. We don't talk about why wages are falling, why it's hard to get a good job, why big cities are expensive, why things like energy and food are increasingly expensive. These kind of big economic problems of our time are basically not discussed at university. So what do we do at university? The main thing is we do maths. So economics nowadays is a very, very heavily mathematized subject. If you don't have a very good maths A-level, you basically can't even get into university to do it. And then when you get into the university, it's just very, very, very heavily mathematical. And once you go into postgrad especially, it's extremely phenomenally mathematical. And it's not easy maths. You're doing kind of a lot of algebra, a lot of simultaneous equations, but basically it's a math subject at this point. And it's important to say that the maths is not easy. So I had a maths and economics undergrad, and I was very good at maths as a kid. But then when I went to do my postgrad at Oxford, even though I was very good at maths, I found the maths quite difficult. And if you want to succeed, if you want to get good grades, you really, really have to spend a lot of time memorizing the maths, basically. And the context for this maths is they basically build a model, like a model economy, and everything affects everything else. So if we cut the interest rate a bit, what does that do to GDP, for example? Or if people suddenly start spending less money, trying to save more, what does that do to inflation? This kind of thing. If the government suddenly raises taxes, how does that affect the economy? And you build this kind of mathematical model. It's like a toy model, like a kind of game in a way. We raise this a little bit, that falls, this thing rises. And that's the kind of model that is basically used in modern economics. But of course, when you build a model, you can't include absolutely everything that exists in the economy. You have to make some simplifications. Some things will be included, some things will not be included. And the models which we study at universities nowadays, one of the big simplifications is that there is no inequality in the model. In fact, it's more than just that there is no inequality in the model. There is only one person in the model. So these models are what they call representative agent models. So rather than looking at 6 or 7 billion people in the world, or like 66 million people in the UK, or 300 million people in the US, they say, to make the model simpler, we are just gonna look at one representative person. So the average person in the whole economy. So all you care about is averages, right? You're just looking at one average person. And of course, if we change the distribution, if I take some wealth from you and give it to Bill Gates, or if I take some wealth from Rishi Sunak and give it to you, that changes the distribution, but it doesn't change the average. So basically, once you build this model, which only looks at the representative agent, which is the average, which is the aggregate, it's not only that there is no inequality in the model, there is not even any possibility for inequality in the model. These are models of averages, these are models of aggregates, which is why when modern economists who've been to these elite universities think about the economy, they tend to think about them in terms of averages or aggregates. So that they're obsessed with the big aggregate measurements of the economy. For example, GDP is of course the classic one, unemployment, inflation, central bank interest rates, level of government spending, level of government taxation. These are things which you can measure on an aggregate economy, but they're nothing to do with how is one person affected versus another person. As soon as you take a model and you make it representative agent, a model of the average person, this model can't say anything about distribution. It can't say anything about this group of people is winning, this group of people is losing. We can't say anything like that in these models. So I think this is really interesting, right? Because if you want to be like an influential economist in the world of policy or academia, you are going to have a PhD, right? So you're going to have 3 years undergrad, 1 year, I did 2 years master. You're going to be doing a PhD for like 3, 4, 5 years. In the US, a PhD is like 7 years. You're going to have to do like some postdoc work, and then you're going to, if you're lucky, become a junior professor. So like by the time you reach a point that you are like influential in economic policy terms, you've been studying these models for like 15 years, like something like that. And the fact that these models don't include any distribution, don't include any inequality, that doesn't explicitly say we don't think inequality is important. But what does it do to a person who has devoted most of their life to the study of economics? That study has consisted of 10, 15 years of very difficult mathematical analysis, mathematical manipulation, of very difficult, very complicated mathematical models with no inequality in them. Like I think this is a very effective way to subconsciously convince, almost subconsciously brainwash a person into believing that inequality doesn't matter. See, you never come out and explicitly say like, inequality doesn't matter. But you say like, here's a really, really complicated game. Here's a really, really complicated mathematical model that you are going to have to spend 15, 20 years of your life understanding in absolute fine detail. And you never even explicitly mention it, but the model doesn't have inequality in it. Doesn't have any distribution, doesn't have any space for that. So imagine you're that kid, you went in 18 years old, and then you spent 15 years of your life paying, locked in libraries, doing really difficult maths with no inequality, no inequality, no inequality. And then, first of all, whenever you think about what's wrong with the economy, you're going to go back to this stuff you studied, right? And you're going to be like, well, maybe the problem is the interest rate is too high, or government spending is too low, or government taxation is too high. You're going to focus on these things that were in the model. You spent 20 years studying that model. Of course, you're going to want to provide answers that are from the model that you told, the model that you've been spending 20 years of your life studying. But if somebody comes to you and says, hey, maybe the problem is inequality, maybe the problem is distribution, how's that going to affect you emotionally? What's your emotional response to that going to be? I think you're going to get like a gut instinct, which is like, no, of course it's not. It's not that. Because if it was that, why the fuck have I spent 20 years studying something that's not even in the model? And also, you kind of have a bit of professional skin in this game, right? Because if this person is right with what they're saying, that the reason the economy gets worse and worse is because of growing inequality, then you have spent 20 years of your life studying something that has nothing to say about the biggest economic issue of our time. And you're a professor now at Chicago or at LSE or at some fancy university, and you've got nothing to say about this. If this is true, you're in big trouble, right? So I think this is the current way that we teach economics is very, very powerful at convincing everyone who has a powerful voice in speaking about economics, in insisting, no, that's not it, that's not it, that's not it, that's not it. But the end result is, most of these discussions are just, 10 people with elite university degrees talking to each other. So it's not that they even have to really deny somebody like me who says inequality is the problem. It's just never in the discussion. It's never in the discussion. It's a little bit like, who Copernicus is. Copernicus is this scientist who discovered that the Earth travels around the sun, and the Earth is just one of many planets traveling around the sun. And like everybody accepts now that this is right. But before him, everybody thought that the Earth was the center of the solar system. I guess it probably wasn't called the solar system at that time, and everything traveled around, including the sun. And they had developed these really complicated mathematical systems of making that work. And the way that works is that all the other planets, they have to do like loop the loops and spinning around. That's the only way that it works to make sense. So all of these guys spent like their whole lives working out these complicated mathematical models of how everything goes around the Earth. And then a guy came and said, actually things don't go around the Earth. And he was massively, massively attacked. Nobody wanted to accept it because you have all of these prestigious academics who have spent their whole life developing models of how things travel around the Earth. I think that's kind of basically where we are now. And if I was right in saying that these guys are just missing the big thing, what would you expect? You would expect basically that their models wouldn't work in the sense that they would constantly generate incorrect predictions. And that is exactly what happens. These guys consistently generate incorrect predictions. So, I've spoken about it many times on this channel and I'll speak about it on the next video on the course. My job was to predict interest rates. And modern economists are basically obsessed with interest rates. Before 2008, they basically thought you could solve pretty much any modern economic problem by just making sure you get that interest rate right. And if you look at the way that our economists react to financial crises and economic crises, how did they react to 2008? Slash the interest rate. How did they react to COVID? Slash the interest rate. How did they react to the inflationary spike after COVID? Rocket the interest rate up. This is basically where our economists sit at the moment, which is the way to deal with any economic crisis is to manipulate the interest rate. So the interest rate is like their key tool that they use, basically. And yet, what are their predictions for their own interest rate like? So I was a pressure interest rate trader from 2008 until 2014. In 2008, after the financial crisis, interest rates were slashed to zero in basically the whole of the rich world. Nobody predicted that. That was a surprise. And because they believe that low interest rates are very economically stimulative, they thought that rates would come up again the next year. They didn't. They then said in 2009, well, we were wrong this year, but rates will come up next year. They didn't. In 2010, they said rates go up in 2011. They didn't. And they continued to predict rates to go up every single year up until 2020 in the middle of COVID. Every single one of those predictions were incorrect. And then they finally said in the midst of COVID, now inflation is so low and will stay so low for so long, interest rates will never go up again. And interest rates immediately went up to 5-6%. So, I know when I come out and say inequality is the big thing, and you live in a world full of economists that say, the problem is things to do with the interest rate, things to do with levels of government spending, things to do with level of taxation. I can sound like a bit of a quack, basically. Why is this guy saying the problem is one thing when all of these prestigious elite economists aren't mentioning it? Well, they're an educational system which never talks about it, and their predictions are constantly wrong. Whereas if you look at my predictions, and I correctly predicted interest rates after the 2008 crisis, but I've also correctly predicted things on this channel. If you go back and look at the first video on this channel, which we'll link in the description, I predicted in the beginning of COVID there would be an inflationary crisis, a cost of living crisis, a huge spike in the stock price, the gold price, house prices, and huge increase in inequality. All of these things have happened. So I know it's easy to dismiss somebody, especially somebody who doesn't come from a rich, privileged background, saying the elites are wrong on this. But the elites are continually generating incorrect predictions. And I'm generating correct predictions here. So I think that what we have at the moment is essentially a broken education system in economics. But there's more to it than that. And the second reason why we don't speak about inequality in economics enough is because we have a system which aggressively takes anybody who is good at predictions out of the conversation. And to explain this, I want you to put yourself in the mind of a young 20, 21-year-old economic student, loves economics, loves the maths, studying at loads at an elite university. You graduate, whatever it is, magna cum laude or whatever, you're top of your class, and then you have to decide what you want to do with your life. So if you want to be in this conversation, if you want to be an academic, or if you want to be advisor to government, or if you want to work in, public policy, you had to stay in academia. You can't just do an undergrad. You're going to have to do a master's. It's going to cost you a lot of money. You're going to do a PhD. You're going to have to work, spend money, locked in libraries. If you're lucky, you might start making money in your mid-30s. Or you can go into the city. Not only does it pay you way, way, way more, but it gives you the opportunity to prove, look, I'm good because I can make predictions. And academia doesn't really care if you can make good predictions. So one thing which was really clear to me in my time in the city and my time in academia is if you're really, really good, you want to be in the city. Because if you're making good predictions, you will be recognized, you'll be paid, and everybody will know that is the guy over there who is right, because they're really aggressively analyzing who is the guy who is making good predictions. They're tracking that and they're paying that. Whereas when I went back to academia in 2017, I had my first lecture at Oxford, and it was about interest rates. And I thought, this is really interesting, right? This is the thing which we've predicted really badly for 10, 15 years. This is the specific area I worked in. This is the area I'm an expert on. It's really interesting, right? If you are at elite university and you're studying something really important, and we've been wrong about it for at that time it was 10 years, now it's more like 15 years. This is interesting, right? This is like a kind of like an unsolved problem. There's a thing that we're really bad at. We can work out why we're bad at it. So I went to the professor, I said, why do you think we've been wrong about interest rates for 10 years? And he said, oh no, we always knew interest rates would stay zero, which is, categorically wrong. And I went back and I showed him the data and I said, look, you've actually been wrong for 10 years. And he said, oh, that's interesting. It never went anywhere. So what this shows is if you're good at predicting, which means you're good at working out why other people are wrong, the city will pay you. Academia won't even notice. It won't even notice. So what does this tell you about academia's ability to improve? If these guys are able to be wrong year after year after year after year for 10 years and not even notice, they're not going to improve. They're not going to improve, basically. So what you have is a situation where anyone who is good and wants to make money is aggressively paid to leave. And if you're good and you stay, even if you are able to correctly identify an area where everyone is consistently wrong, they don't really care and they're not going to listen. So what kind of person stays in academia when they know that if they're good, they will do much better and get paid much better leaving academia and going into finance? Basically people from rich families. It doesn't make sense to do that if you're not from a rich family. If you have the option, I made millions of pounds in the city, and that is what paid for this flat. And when my brother needed to buy a house, I helped him. My sister's trying to buy a house, I'm helping her. People from ordinary families cannot afford to make that choice if they're good. So the kind of people who stay in academia, you need to be either not good enough to get into finance, from a rich family, or basically a little bit mad. And this is what happens. And so you have this system which kind of brainwashes people into saying inequality doesn't exist, it doesn't matter. Doesn't listen to people who are right and have who are demonstrably better in their predictions. And aggressively takes everybody who's half good out of the conversation. And if you do go into finance, obviously then once you're in finance, you can make a lot of money making good predictions, but you're not allowed to speak publicly. So when I was a trader, I was making a lot of money betting that inequality would devastate living standards and keep interest rates low and push house prices up and push stock prices up and push inequality up further. But I wasn't allowed to say anything about these things. I had another point which I need to make on this. So the third reason economists don't talk about inequality is that pretty much all powerful, influential economists are quite rich. They're quite rich, they're generally from rich families. If they weren't from rich families, they probably wouldn't have stayed in academia. Economics has the worst social representation of different social classes of any subject in the big American universities. So you have rich people who've gone in to study this subject. They probably don't need money, otherwise they would have gone into finance. And then they get paid to work for a think tank or work for a newspaper, and they themselves are quite rich and comfortable. The people who pay them are probably quite rich. They're heavily incentivized not to talk about inequality. right? It's in a quite obvious way, which is when somebody is rich and comfortable, they want to keep things the way they are. You know, when you talk about a crisis of inequality, it hurts most people quite badly because wealth tends to concentrate at the very top. But there's a sort of, you know, the top 1%, especially top 0.1% does really, really well. But there's like 5 or 6% at the top that benefit from that. And these guys include basically any economist with a voice. So economists are wealthy. They don't want to talk about inequality. They've got a massive amount of skin in the game saying that inequality doesn't matter. 20 years, 30 years of education studying something which has nothing to say about inequality. They need this to not be a problem. Okay, so to conclude, why do economists not talk about inequality? Primarily, it comes from an education system which completely neglects to discuss it, which means that anyone who is involved in this discussion has studied for 20 years without ever talking about this. So it basically indoctrinates them into believing this is not a problem. And also they have a massive incentive in pushing that, because otherwise their education is a waste of time. It's rich people, it works for them and their class interests. Anyone who is really good at this is paid out of the game and paid to keep their mouth shut. So basically they're not going to fix this. So what does that mean? I'm filming this video at the back end of 2024. We had an election this year in the UK where the centre-left Labour Party beat the centre-right Conservative Party. And I think people often think that the reason that politicians do nothing about inequality is because they're representing their own interests. It's important to recognise there's kind of this whole class of slightly self-serving, slightly idiotic, very posh, very rich economists that are holding this up. And they're going to do nothing about inequality. Inequality will get worse and worse. Living standards for ordinary people will fall. And these people are not going to stop it. So the responsibility has to fall upon ordinary people themselves to stop it. When I first started talking about these things publicly in 2020, I was writing articles for newspapers. I wrote an article for The Guardian, and those articles are mainly being read by quite posh, quite privileged, quite rich people. And I was convinced that we were not going to get positive change by talking to the group of people who benefit from the growth in inequality. So I made consciously the switch to YouTube to try to convince ordinary people they need to do something. And that's why we're doing this channel. So I would encourage people to support, keep watching these videos. I think the next video we will do on this will be a little bit talking about my personal experience and how I came to become convinced that inequality was the problem. And then we'll keep doing different educational bits and bobs that will build up the understanding. But that's it, part 3 of the conversation. Why economists never talk about inequality, because the universities train them not to, and because they're very rich and they're doing just fine, thanks. Okay, thank you.